We're with our favorite child psychologist, Dr. Katyana Azman, this morning for Growing
Hi.
Pains. Hey, Dr.
We
Katyana.
have a special guest today. Please don't mind her. She's
Hello,
joining us today.
kitty. I heard she's a senior citizen now.
She is. She's a senior citizen. She's 15 human years old and
Wow.
doing fabulously, but often very capable when people are doing things and she wants to know what's going on. So yes, she's kind of sitting behind me at the moment.
Yeah,
Like
she can
most
do
old people.
whatever she wants.
Yes,
We won't
yes.
stop her.
Yes, exactly.
Now, today we're going to talk about the importance of play, especially for children. So,
Yes.
first of all, what are some of the benefits of play for children?
Well, we kind of have to look to, again, sort of like how their brain is developing, right? So sort of in the earlier stages of childhood, the human brain is doing a lot of growing. So prior to the age of 5, your brain is doing this probably the most rapid amount of growing that it will be doing for the rest of your lifespan. And up to by the time you hit 5, they say that 90% of the human brain is fully developed, with the remaining 10 slowly kind of growing until you're about the age of about 28 or 29. So what play actually does is that it allows us to actually learn about the world around us, because the parts of the brain that are responsible for understanding verbal instruction, understanding problem solving, or that there are long-term consequences for actions, all of that is still very much developing. And so play allows us to bridge that gap between what our brain is capable of learning at that age with actual introduction of knowledge. And what I think a lot of people tend to overlook is that play is not just about
Physical development.
Exactly. You're learning about sensory skills, you're learning about colors, you're learning about textures, you're learning about problem solving, how things work, you're learning about how to interact with another individual if you're playing in a group, or you're learning how to be responsible for things if it's your toys. So there's a lot of benefits to play, especially for young children.
But can lack of play affect a child's development? If a child has not been played with or have things to play with, can it affect their development as a whole?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of research that has been done into the impact of play, especially in sort of like the infancy, toddler stages. And they found that there's a lot of negative side effects. Of course, we're not saying that they won't develop into functional human beings. Of course not. But there are certain things that would be a challenge. So for example, fine motor skills might not be as developed. If you're talking about sort of the interaction skills, there were quite a number of studies being conducted, I believe, in sort of like the 80s. I think, that looked at the impact of children who grew up in orphanages, and how the lack of interaction affect their social development, their emotional development, even their gross motor skills. And it wasn't very positive what the findings were, because the children in those environments were often left in a cot all day, were never cuddled, were never given toys. And so those are the types of things that I think have put a lot of support towards play. But I think that, generally it's more just the fact that we are providing our children with a platform with which their brain can respond more effectively. Because it's kind of, if anyone who has a toddler at home, try kind of giving your child verbal instructions. It's probably not going to be very successful.
Yeah.
And that's just because of the way the brain is doing all this growing and putting 2 and 2 together. So play kind of does that really, really well.
Speaking of toys, right? I mean, the toy industry, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And like, I have a mountain of toys, set up for my child.
Yes.
How important is it for our children, especially the younger children, to play with toys?
It's really, really important, because of course we have to look at the nature of the toys, right? So depending on the level of their development, there are toys that are more appropriate. So for example, children who are sort of probably around the ages of 1 and below, things with a lot of bright colors, things with no detachable pieces that they might put in their mouth. Those are the types of things that we'll be looking at, and things that focus on more gross motor skills, because their fine motor won't be as developed at that age. So oftentimes you'll see toys that involve big buttons that they can press with the palm of their hand, and grasping and things like that. But as they get older, those toys need to adapt and change, because the other function of toys is also stimulating them. Right. So either from a sensory perspective or from a thinking perspective, sorry, don't mind that. And also, and so if we're giving, say, a 6-year-old a toy that's appropriate for a toddler, it might not be stimulating them in the way that they need to be.
Do you need to get that, doctor?
No, it's all good.
Is that the home phone or what?
I think we're expecting a delivery.
Okay.
It was 11:11 a few days ago, and so I think my household went a bit nuts. So that's happened.
Okay. Let's get back to like if you give a 6-year-old a toddler's toy. Yeah.
Yes, if you give a 6-year-old a toddler's toy, there's a very big possibility that you are understimulating them, because at that stage, their brains are kind of developing more problem-solving skills. And so if you're giving them something that's kind of very one-dimensional, it's not doing what it's probably designed to do. And so it is very important to find toys that are appropriate given their age. And then conversely, if you're giving a toddler something that's designed for a 12-year-old, it wouldn't be effective as well. Yeah. So I think that toys teach kids a lot more things than parents really realize, because I think as adults, we might not see the benefits of it because we're like, I don't know how this works. But for kids, it's definitely really important because it's teaching them multifaceted skills. And it's not just about pressing a button, even though that might be what it looks like for us. Yeah.
Speaking of pressing a button though, nowadays young kids, they play a lot with tech only though.
Gadgets.
Gadgets. Is that a good thing?
It's actually not. We within the medical/mental health community are actually not a big fan of devices for kids. In fact, my hospital is super strict, and we actually have a policy that my pediatrician colleagues have told me, where they tell parents with children under the age of 2, like 0 screen time. So we're saying no TV, no iPad, no phones, nothing if you're under the age of 2, and up to the age of 5, you should only be using your tablet once 1 hour a day. So I think that, we are seeing a trend with regards to children who are just being given devices where fine motor skills are not the best because they're just literally using this function most of the time. Yeah.
Just that one index finger.
Yes, that one index finger. It's crazy. I see like toddlers like immediately knowing how to unlock a device, and it just blows my mind. But fine motor skills are not being developed as well, not being developed as it should. We're seeing a lot of sort of sensory issues. I think out of 10 children I see in the clinic, I'm seeing sensory issues in about 6 to 7 of them. So it's becoming extremely...
What does that mean, sensory issues?
So sensory processing dysregulation or sensory processing disorder is a condition where the brain kind of learns about the sensory world slightly backward. It's not caused by brain damage or anything. We don't fully understand why it happens, but the theory is that children are not being exposed to the senses as much as when our generation was growing up and climbing trees and rolling in the mud. So our brain doesn't have the stimuli. And so when we're getting the stimuli, it kind of the brain kind of connects the wires a bit differently. So we're getting kids who are responding very adversely to sounds and smells and tastes and textures and lights or visual sort of cues. To the point where it can actually affect focus. It can affect behavior. Some kids will do something called sensory seeking, where they will go out and try to get that stimulation because they're kind of like numbed out. So it's not a debilitating condition, but it can really affect functioning. And I'm seeing a lot of kids off late coming in with all of these sensory issues. And I think part of it is just also because we're not really exposing our kids to the sensory world. That's why you see this trend of parents doing a lot of sensory play or messy play. And that was kind of like the latest movement to counteract that. And so screen time really kind of affects it because you're not getting the benefit of sensory information. You're just rubbing your finger against a glass. There's also the fact that you're also exposing your children to a lot of sort of those flashing images. And one of the things I've also found not so great is that because of the way that the screens and the videos and the games work, it triggers the part of your child's brain that demands instant gratification. So you get kids who are already naturally very impulsive, a lot more impulsive than they usually are. So I'm not a big fan of screens. I understand that it fulfills a purpose for some parents who are just like, I can't go through mealtime without a screen. I understand that it definitely fulfills a purpose, but it doesn't replace the presence of actual like toys.
That's so scary. Oh my goodness. Now I have to go and check my 4-year-old, see whether he has some sensory issues or not. But let's get back to play, Dr. Katyana. How important is it for parents to play along with their children or other children playing with our children?
Really important. So that goes back to kind of the socialization or the social development component, right? Which is something that is so important in kids, because moving on from play-based learning, the next sort of area with which kids learn is socializing, right? Or through their interaction with their peers. And so that's kind of like the next stage as they move into primary school and high school. So not giving them the building blocks for that can be really, really debilitating for them. So one is teaching them social skills. It's teaching them things like sharing, right? Which kids do struggle with generally. It's also teaching them, it's also kind of helping with the bonding, I feel, especially if you have younger children, because that is still something that is so important. Your kids will remember the types of interactions and the types of activities that you do with them more than they would sort of the things you buy them, right? So that's kind of why it's so important. I tell parents to be able to be involved. You don't have to dedicate hours and hours and hours if you don't have it, but you should at least be able to interact, because your kids, especially the little ones, would probably kind of take your cues on how to do things, right? So again, if we're giving them, for example, building blocks, something very, very basic, your child would probably only know how to maybe bang them together or to kind of like scatter them around. They probably don't have the problem solving skills to be able to think about building a tower or doing things like that. And that's where your role can actually help guide them in that area. So you're giving them ideas that they might not generally or organically have because of their age. So yeah, it's super important for multiple reasons.
How about playing with like no toys? Like for example, playing catch or playing like family, that kind of thing. Because I think my son is quite into playing family now. Like he'll pretend he's the brother, or he'll pretend he's the daddy, and you are the mommy, and
Oh, bless him. Yeah, that's actually really good, because the other thing that play does, and so irrespective of whether you have toys or not, play also helps with what developing on creativity and imagination, which is an age appropriate skill. So look, whether a child is able to imaginary play is actually a criteria when we assess for whether the child is developing appropriately. So children who don't know how to play, sort of like do your tea parties and do things like that, have imaginary play, are not meeting certain developmental milestones. So it is a sort of a red flag. So children who are able to play sort of in this imaginary sense, being very creative, is actually a really, really good thing. And so, I tell parents, it really isn't about saying that you have to have the coolest, most expensive toys. Some of my families who can't afford it have a lot of toys that they've made out of the kitchen, things with like beads and, like lolly sticks and things like that, which is kind of like what we grew up with more than, back when we didn't have all these cool toys.
Yeah.
So I think that the main focus is play, right? Secondary to play with toys and with some type of tool. And then third is play with some type of device. So that's kind of how I would look at it in a hierarchy, if I could.
Okay. But how about older kids then, Katyana? Like, for example, they've reached a certain age, teenagers. All they want to play with are video games, computer games. Is that still important when they reach the teenage years?
Yes, it's still important. Like I said, we are a little bit more accepting of the role of technology as they kind of reach the teenage years. I have some families who tell me that if they choose not to give their child a device or access to online games, they kind of get ostracized, because socially, that's what all the kids in that bracket are doing.
Yeah.
So as they get older, it is definitely more acceptable for them to be playing sort of more online related games. But if you kind of reflect back on when it was sort of our generation, when we didn't have online games as much, we were playing, we were congregating and playing board games, we were congregating and playing, team sports. And so it's really important, because you're still learning a lot of things from play, but I think it sort of shifts more towards the socialization component, the teamwork component, if they're playing things in groups. So I'm actually a really big fan in incorporating play for as long as humanly possible. So I do still get very stressed when I see parents say to me that their kids go to school and come home at like 3-4 p.m. and then they're doing tuition and extra classes till they go to bed, and they don't have a single time to kind of play and de-stress and do things like that. It's still really, really important, even if you're dealing with a teenager.
Okay. But is there such a thing? But is there such a thing as too much play?
I think it depends on the age for sure. With toddlers, I don't think so. I personally don't think there's anything such as too much play for a toddler, for a child who hasn't started primary. I'm a big supporter of play-based learning at that age.
Mm-hmm.
So I often tell parents to be very wary of sending their children to institutions or to organizations that focus on a lot of academics at that age. I had a case a few years ago where I had a little girl who was 3 years old who come to me because the teacher said she couldn't do 3 hours of written work, and that was a problem by the school standards.
3 hours? I can't do 3 hours of written work.
Thank you. That's exactly what I said to the parents when she showed up. And so I think that, I'm a big fan of sort of play-based learning because it engages their attention a lot longer and it has all these benefits. But once, of course, they start primary, there are going to be responsibilities that they have to engage. I would still be leaning towards more play-based as compared to a majority of academics. But I say once they reach sort of upper primary, you have the permission to kind of start weaning back on play. So by the time your child reaches high school level, they should be, of course, majority would be sort of day-to-day life skills, learning and things like that. And then play being more of a minority. But when they're that young, before primary school or sort of early primary, I don't think there's such a thing as too much play.
Actually,
yeah, then when they get to their teenage years, they'll be like, stop playing your video game.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, you know what? I'm just wondering, do kids who are like the only child, right? Where they have to have I have to go out and play with my friends and everything, compared to kids who have brothers and sisters where they're playing constantly. Is there a difference in how they develop?
Yeah, there are some differences, just because they're not getting maybe as much peer interaction as they would if they're in a household full of adults. This is not backed by science, this is from observation, but what I've noticed is that a lot of these kids who grow up without siblings will often have very different speech skills because they're around adults more of the time. So their language skills will be slightly different as compared to kids who had more peers or more kids growing up. So things like that would be different. So, I think it really depends on the access. I do have some clients, for example, who only have one child, and maybe the child is still kind of on the younger side and they choose not to send their kids to preschool. And so the child is only at home with mom or dad all day. And definitely their social skills are very much impacted as compared to kids with siblings. So, it definitely is an issue. So if you are the kind of parent where you just have one child, but you're allowing your child to engage socially as much as they can, either with neighbors' kids, with cousins, with, a play group, then you're good. So it really depends on kind of the amount of interaction that they're getting.
How about can children actually play with toys on their own?
It's actually really okay if they can play on their own. There's actually one of the milestones that we look at is whether a child can organize their play independently. That's a milestone that we look for in children, I believe, when they've reached about 3 or 4 years old, meaning that they don't kind of rely on you to tell them what to play. They should be able to initiate play on their own. So it is good if they can play by themselves, but what is important is that they do not favor or prefer it. That would be another red flag to look for, is if a child is averse to any type of socialization. So say he's playing by himself and then you come over or someone else comes over and he kind of just turns his body away and it's just nope, that is something that is atypical. So we'd want to make sure that, he's happy to play by himself. He's happy to play with someone else. He might struggle with sharing. That's okay. But if he's averse and seems almost afraid of socialization, then that's an issue. So, but it's okay if he can play by himself.
Yeah, because I'm I'll tell my son, I buy all these toys for you to play on your own. And he can play on his own for a little while. And then after that, he was like, Mommy, can you play with me?
He's 4, right?
Yes, he's 4.
Yeah, so attention span,
4.
attention span at 4 is probably about as big as a teaspoon. They really can't do things on their own for an extended period of time. They will try to get people, and the fact that he comes to you and be like, Mommy, play with me is a good sign, right? But his attention span will grow as he ages, but for now it's probably going to be about a couple of minutes if you're lucky. I
worry because that's me.
You haven't grown out of that phase yet, huh?
He hasn't gone past that phase yet.
Now, Katyana, any last words, any last advice for parents with regards to the importance of play?
I tell parents this all the time. Play is ridiculously important. I know there's a lot of focus on academics and learning, but you can also do that with play. And in fact, you'll probably find it more effective integrating learning or topics into play as you would sitting your child down with a book and expecting him or her to read it, especially when they're quite young. So, and again, it's irrespective of whether you have the actual toys. You can actually cultivate these things at home using very accessible ingredients. Like you said, it doesn't even have to be with toys if you can't afford it. You can just be sort of like one-to-one interaction with your child. But play is something that is so important for your child's physical, emotional, social, and cognitive development, every single area on the spectrum that we look at. And so regardless of how old your child is, you need to make sure that your child has time to play, because that will ensure that they turn out a lot happier, a lot more well-adjusted, and a lot more prepped to learn about the real world. So yeah.
Actually, a lot of dads would want to know this. How young can or how old can they be before we start putting our sons especially into like those little boy football teams and everything?
Oh, I think it really just depends on interest, right? Like, I think if your child is showing interest in football or, rugby or whatever when they're at a young age, if it's safe for them, then go at it, right? Make sure you make it more about the game, the sport and the fun rather than about winning. Maybe something that we have to reinforce, right? But I think it's really just start sort of as young as you can. Like I know some of my clients who've got kids as young as like 2 or 3 who are interested in golf and they've started that. I've got some kids start like golf at 2 or 3. I've got some kids who are in those little league football games and baseball games. And so I think if your child expresses an interest, then, if it's safe for them, like I probably wouldn't enroll a toddler in rugby just because of, the contact. But if it's safe for them and they enjoy it and it's something that you can participate in because of a mutual interest, then it's a good idea. Oh, he's mute.
Unmute.
Team sports or individual sports is better? Because team teaches them to be in a team and also teaches about hierarchy and to listen to instructions and stuff like that, right?
Yes. So team sports, if you can pull it off, I would prioritize team sports because of all the things that you mentioned. Yes, there are solo sports that kids can still do if it's about kind of teaching them other skills, but based on the age, it's socialization and teamwork, and listening to instructions is something that's sort of a really major factor or main factor. So team sports, if they're interested, but at the very most, if your kid's not super social, like I've got some kids who favor things like swimming and all that, that's kind of like less interactive, then they can do that, but make sure you still give them opportunities to socialize through other activities. So yeah.